Hi, everybody. Like Bill said, my name is Dylan Etkin, and I'm the JIRA architect. I've been working for Atlassian for the last 5 years, and I'm going to talk to you today about the anatomy of a JIRA feature. Now, keep in mind, it is a lightning talk, so this is going to be super quick. I'm not going to get to dive very deep into anything, but what I hope that you can come away from this talk knowing is a little bit how we use Atlassian tools for each stage of a feature. So the first thing to realize, I think, is that a feature is a really large construct. It spans a long period of time, and it has a number of different distinct phases. And at Atlassian, we tend to use different tool sets for each one of those different phases. So the first phase is sort of this idea or high-level planning. So you take that idea and you sort of crystallize it into something via, for us, it's Confluence. So at Atlassian, we have an extranet, which is a Confluence version, and it's heavily patronized by the Atlassian staff. So what we tend to do is we throw things at that extranet, and it's a really great mechanism for getting a lot of really good feedback from the smart engineers that work at Atlassian. So the next phase of a feature is usually once we kind of know what it is that we want to build, or we've crystallized it and turned it from concept into something a little bit more molded. What we do is a release and iteration planning. So on the JIRA team, we use agile methodologies. So we tend to have like this meetings where we sit down and we try and create these epics all the way through to stories, all the way through to tasks, so that we can track the feature. And that primarily uses JIRA and Green Hopper to do that sort of stuff. And then there's obviously the development work, getting the thing actually done, which again is utilizing JIRA and Green Hopper to do that, and then heavily relying on Bamboo to keep ourselves honest and to make sure that things don't go pear-shaped. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these phases a little bit more and give some examples to try and give you an idea of how we actually do these things. So an idea and high-level planning, I think you've probably heard a lot about that at Summit already, but a few places where ideas come from for the JIRA team, the primary place that it's come over the last 5 years that I've been working here is actually you, the customer. So our jira.atlassian.com JIRA instance has a ton of improvements and feature requests, and those sort of vary in terms of the amount of detail that are up there, but often that's a really great source for what will be coming next or what we should be doing. Another place that we've gotten a lot of feature ideas from is 20% and FedEx days. So a number of our 20% projects and FedEx days have actually turned into features. And then one example is founders, right? So this happens all the time. In JIRA 4.0, we had JQL, and that actually was a founder idea. So Mike Cannon-Brooks was on, I think, 3 different flights. He had his laptop, and he created this little, what do you call it, like a little demo of what would be JQL, right? And then he came back to Sydney, and he threw it over the wall, and that was that. So there we are standing with this idea for a query language, but we really didn't know exactly what we wanted it to do. We didn't even know what we wanted the language to look like. Did we want it to be a sort of Google-like syntax, which is more human-friendly, or did we want it to be more SQL-like? So immediately we went to the blogs and threw something out there. We got a lot of input from the different engineers at Atlassian for the pros and the cons on each side, heavily utilizing Confluence. Then to determine what the language syntax was going to look like, again, that was a number of different Confluence pages that iterated over a number of ideas, sort of just molding or crystallizing the concept so that we could feel comfortable once we were done with that whole process to move to the next phase, which is release and iteration planning, right? So being an agile shop, the way iteration and release planning looks on the JIRA team, you basically get a bunch of people in one big room. So we have an internal instance of JIRA and Green Hopper, which is always running the bleeding edge. We call it JDog, so we can dog food things. Basically, you sit down in this room, in the boardroom, and we project via a projector our planning board, and that's our instance of JIRA and Green Hopper up there. And you get basically the architect, the product manager, the development team, the QA staff, all the stakeholders in one room. And the product manager will have gone and placed the epics into the system initially, and that's informed by the previous step, right, the crystallized idea. And then the release planning basically is turning those epics into stories and allowing everybody to participate in the prioritization of the stories that we're creating, and then story pointing those things. And then, of course, we come back together again for the iteration planning, where we turn those stories more into tasks, and we actually give them hour-long estimates. But the really important thing about that, and the great thing that JIRA and Green Hopper allow us to do, is that we get to capture all of that information, and it's once everybody's sort of sitting in the room together. So you get developers and stakeholders all having a sort of shared understanding of what these stories mean, and also a buy-in to what the prioritization of those stories are, right? And it's a great place to sort of capture our data. So an example of that was in JIRA 4.2. You've probably heard this from some of the other talks. We're going to add logging work to a workflow transition. That was came from Jack, so it came from the customers. It was a pretty easy one to understand what the concept was, but then in release planning, we got to a point where we realized technically we didn't exactly understand how we were going to go about trying to create that. So what we had was this concept of a spike task, right? And that goes right onto the top of our backlog into the first iteration, and maybe it's like a time-boxed thing where we have 3 days and we plan out, we're going to just attack this thing and try and figure out enough information so that we can all come back together again and then plan out more specific tasks that'll actually ride us all the way to the end and the completion of being able to plan out that feature. So obviously we have these great crystallized ideas now, we have this wonderful planning, but somebody actually needs to sit down and do something, right? And that's the development phase, which again is going to rely heavily on JIRA and Greenhopper, but sort of with a different flavor. Instead of stories and epics, we're talking more here around tasks and issues. Now, the development thing is also kind of interesting because it's a two-sided coin, right? Like on the one side, you've got your developers, and what JIRA and Greenhopper do really well for them is, like I mentioned, we have a prioritized backlog, and it allows the developers to know very quickly what is the task that they need to grab off of that prioritized backlog, what should they be doing right now. They've already bought into sort of the estimates that are associated with that, and they can transition the issue through workflow and add time tracking. Now, the other side of that coin is the stakeholders, right? So the PM and the team lead, Mike and Scott, anybody at Atlassian who's interested in the health of that iteration or knowing how well we're tracking against what we're trying to do. And the real power of keeping all of our data in Greenhopper and JIRA is that we kind of get that stuff for free for the stakeholders, right? So we're utilizing the JIRA dashboard and the Agile gadget that come with Greenhopper, and like you've seen plenty at Summit, the wall boards, to really display, like as an information radiator, what's going on with the health of our iteration. So it's the developer's job to keep that information up to date. In other words, keep the issues transitioning through the workflow and keep the issues up to date with your work log. And then throughout the week, throughout the iteration, the stakeholders have the ability to sort of jump in and adjust things as need may be. Also, it's important to note that we've introduced QA over the last couple of years. So our JIRA workflows are set up such that we don't just go from an in progress to a done. We actually go from an in progress to a QA, and then the QA have the ability to sort of reject our work, and that keeps it active and puts it back into the in progress state. And the other thing that I can't really stress enough that we use here, is Bamboo. Every commit inside of JIRA will trigger off a series of builds, and it's a serious amount of builds. It's about 45, right? It goes from our unit tests, which then turn around and trigger off our integration tests, which turn around and trigger our JavaScript-based integration tests. We have so many tests that we've actually had to go through hoops to try and make them run faster. So we actually take the whole block of our tests and break them up into what we call batches, and we run them in a parallel fashion. So pretty much we've gotten to the point where when you make a commit, about 45 minutes later, you know whether you've left the world in a sane place or an insane place. And JIRA being such an old product, adding a new feature is always a really risky endeavor in terms of, regressions. So really Bamboo for us keeps us sane. If we weren't running those tests all the time, then we would really not be able to keep developing these features at the speed that we're developing. And then the other thing that's important to realize with Bamboo that it gives us is its build telemetry, right? Like you've seen with the wall boards, you can post your build status up on that telemetry board. So not only are the stakeholders able to see if the build is healthy or not, but the developers are too. So usually that's what happens, right? You wake up in the morning and you go, red, great. And that means somebody needs to get on top of what's going on and figure out what's happening. But you get that instant feedback, and that's what the tools really give us to allow us to complete these features. So lightning talk, lightning quick, that's pretty much what I got to tell you. Again, I just want you to kind of take away that we utilize Confluence to drive our specifications and crystallize our features, and to really tap into the excellent human resources that we have at Atlassian to really let everybody help play and mold the feature at that initial phase, right? And then once we've got that information specific enough, we move into JIRA and Greenhopper, and that's where the information really lives. That's where it lives its entire life cycle. And the reporting that we get out of that is awesome, because we get to sort of keep everybody informed and everybody, oh, and my time is up. And Bamboo keeps us all sane. So if anybody has any questions, I think we have a couple of minutes now. Yep, I can do that. Does anybody have any? Sorry, this light is blinding. Yeah, in the back.
You mentioned you have an in-progress and an in-QA in Greenhopper. How does that work with time tracking between different teams?
Right, okay, so the question was, I mentioned that we have a workflow that has a specific in-progress and QA, and the question was, how does the time tracking work between different teams? Right, so what we tend to do on the JIRA team is we've divided up into different sub-teams. So usually what you'll have is like the UX team, or the, say, we call it the small improvements team, or the engine room team doing some set of work, and they will have QA engineers that are working alongside of them. So really the time tracking is more specific to the individual sub-team and that sub-team's iteration goals, right? So the time tracking, there's QA tasks that also play into the iteration goals. So the QA team get time allocated for our iteration as well. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does. Yep, I've got somebody right there.
You mentioned using JIRA for prioritizing your tasks as you're coming up with all your stories and coming up with all your tasks, and using the interface there to do that instead of sticky notes and a table. One of the things that is an issue is when you have a larger, more complex project, you need to see a lot more than what a screen's worth of information can give you. How do you overcome the sort of straw or telescope view of what you're looking at and not being able to see the whole in order to be able to manage all the different elements of your plan?
Okay, let me try and summarize this question. I think it was basically when you have a ton of work, how do you prioritize that via the Greenhopper interface? Is that fairly accurate? Okay. And the answer is we try and minimize the amount of work that we're going to plan at any given time, right? Agile's a real big fan of that. And honestly, it's the only way that we can scale these big features. So what we tend to do is we'll have a story, like the epic is sort of what spans that huge amount of work, but the stories are usually broken down. And we try and not make tasks that will go much longer than a day. Otherwise, we find that the developer isn't very clear on what they're actually going to be doing. And it's not clear to others. If that guy gets hit by a bus or falls sick or something like that, nobody's going to be able to walk in there and take over that task because it's sort of too large. And then we still do get an awful lot of like small subtasks and that sort of thing. And I think that's why you see in Greenhopper, actually, when you mouse over on the next page, you get a list of all the issues, and now you can drag from that, because we were whinging our brains out about, oh, we got to pull this thing and prioritize it up above this list. So yeah, I mean, pretty much, I think that new feature has really helped us a lot. And then we try and keep it smaller in terms of the iteration size. So we keep some of our stories in the backlog outside in the release level and not so much in the iteration planning level. I think that's me. Thank you, everybody.